in the rugged mountains of Colorado Territory, where winter winds cut through a man's soul like razors and survival depended more on grit than grace, there lived cowboys who'd seen enough heartbreak to fill every valley between Denver and the Pomertz, Utah line. Men like Jake Sullivan knew that love was just another word for weakness, a luxury that got you killed or left you broken on the unforgiving frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sullivan had watched his father drink himself to death over a woman who'd run off with a traveling salesman, had seen strong men reduced to begging fools over fickle hearts, and had sworn on his mother's grave that he'd never let emotion cloud his judgment the way it had destroyed so many others. But sometimes the very thing we guard our hearts against has a way of finding us when we least expect it, dressed in the most unlikely disguise, carrying secrets that challenge everything. We thought we knew about strength, faith, and the mysterious ways that grace can enter even the most hardened life. What Jake Sullivan discovered in his barn on that snow-swept November morning in 1875 would not only shatter his carefully constructed walls, but transform an entire community and teach them all that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come not from drawing your gun, but from opening your heart to the impossible. The autumn of 1875 had painted Willow Creek, Colorado Territory, in shades of gold and amber before winter's early arrival stripped the aspen trees bare and left the small frontier town bracing for what promised to be a harsh season. Nestled in a valley between towering pine-covered ridges, Willow Creek existed as one of those settlements that seemed to balance precariously between growth and abandonment, its future as uncertain as the next season's weather. The town consisted of little more than a main street lined with weathered buildings, a general store that served as the unofficial town hall, a small chapel that saw more weddings than Sunday services, and the weathered oak saloon where men gathered to forget their troubles and sometimes create new ones. Jake Sullivan rode into town that crisp November morning with the same purposeful stride that had characterized his movements for the past 5 years since he'd inherited the ranch from his uncle. At 28, he'd already earned a reputation as one of the most dependable cattlemen in the territory, a man who paid his debts promptly, kept his word without fail, and maintained a polite but distant relationship with everyone in Willow Creek. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of someone who'd spent countless hours scanning horizons, and his hands carried the calluses and scars that marked him as a man who understood that survival meant hard work and harder choices. The Sullivan Ranch sat 3 miles north of town, a modest spread of rolling pasture land bordered by stands of pine and cottonwood. It wasn't the largest operation in the valley. That distinction belonged to Marcus Blackwood's sprawling empire, but it was well managed and profitable enough to provide Jake with the independence he valued above all else. He ran maybe 200 head of cattle with the help of Daniel Murphy, an Irish immigrant who drifted west after the Civil War and found purpose in the rhythm of ranch life. Daniel was one of the few people Jake trusted completely, a quiet man who understood that some silences were more valuable than conversation. Thomas Mitchell's General Store served as the heartbeat of Willow Creek's commercial life, and Jake made his weekly supply run with the same methodical efficiency he applied to everything else. Tom Mitchell, a portly man in his 50s with permanently ink-stained fingers from keeping the town's books, had watched Jake grow from the sullen teenager who'd arrived to claim his inheritance into the respected rancher he'd become. Mitchell understood Jake's reserved nature better than most, having witnessed the young man's careful construction of emotional barriers after a brief but devastating romance with a banker's daughter from Denver who decided that frontier life wasn't quite as romantic as she'd imagined. Sarah Winters taught school in Willow Creek 3 days a week and assisted Doc Peterson with his medical practice the rest of the time. She was one of the few women in town who could hold an intelligent conversation about anything beyond domestic concerns, and Jake found her company tolerable in small doses. Sarah had arrived from St. Louis 2 years earlier with a teaching certificate and a determination to bring education to frontier children. But she'd quickly discovered that her duties extended far beyond the classroom. In a town where the doctor was pushing 70 and battling arthritis, Sarah had become essential to the community's health and welfare. The relationship between Jake and Sarah remained cordially distant, though several town busybodies had attempted to manufacture romance between them. Sarah respected Jake's competence and integrity, while Jake appreciated her intelligence and dedication to her work. Neither seemed particularly interested in pursuing anything deeper, much to the disappointment of Willow Creek's matchmakers. Jake had made it clear through his actions, if not his words, that he considered romantic attachments to be complications he couldn't afford, while Sarah appeared content with her independence and her work. Sheriff Bob Hayes had known Jake since the young man's arrival in Willow Creek, and he'd watched with approval as the initially angry and lost teenager had channeled his pain into building something worthwhile. Hayes was a practical lawman who understood that keeping peace in a frontier town required more diplomacy than gunplay, and he'd come to rely on Jake's level-headed judgment during the occasional disputes that arose between ranchers or when traveling. Troublemakers decided to test Willow Creek's limits. The sheriff recognized in Jake a kindred spirit, another man who'd learned that emotional distance was often the price of effectiveness in a world that demanded quick decisions and firm action. The Weathered Oak Saloon provided the social center for Willow Creek's male population, and Jake would occasionally stop in for a single whiskey and brief conversation with the other ranchers. He never lingered long, never drank to excess, and never participated in the card games that sometimes lasted until dawn. The saloon's owner, a former Army cook named Pete Kowalski, respected Jake's moderation and often served him information, along with his whiskey, keeping him informed about the various undercurrents of gossip and speculation that flowed through the establishment like an underground river. Marcus Blackwood represented everything that Jake instinctively distrusted about wealth and power. The land baron had arrived in the territory with Eastern money and political connections, rapidly acquiring vast holdings through a combination of legitimate purchases and questionable dealings with territorial officials. Blackwood's ranch employed dozens of men, many of whom carried themselves more like hired guns than cowboys, and his influence extended far beyond his property lines. Jake had managed to avoid direct conflict with Blackwood thus far, but he'd noticed the increasing pressure the man applied to smaller ranchers, always accompanied by generous offers to purchase their land at prices that seemed reasonable until you realized they weren't really offers at all. Victor Crane served as Blackwood's primary enforcer, a soft-spoken man with cold eyes who'd arrived from Kansas with a reputation that preceded him like a storm front. Crane had a talent for making problems disappear without creating obvious evidence of wrongdoing, and his presence in Willow Creek had subtly altered the social dynamics of the community. Smaller ranchers found themselves facing unexpected difficulties with their operations, minor legal challenges that required expensive resolutions, and equipment failures that seemed to occur with suspicious frequency. Jake had so far avoided Crane's attention, but he'd noticed the pattern and prepared accordingly. Father Gabriel Rodriguez visited Willow Creek once a month, traveling a circuit that covered 6 small communities scattered across the territory. The young priest had been educated in Santa Fe and spoke 3 languages fluently, but his most valuable skill was his ability to listen without judgment to the confessions and concerns of frontier people struggling with isolation, hardship, and moral uncertainties. Jake respected Father Rodriguez's dedication and intelligence, though he'd made it clear that his own relationship with faith remained complicated by losses and disappointments that prayer hadn't seemed to address. The approaching winter promised to be particularly harsh, with early snows already dusting the higher peaks and weather patterns. suggesting a season that would test every family's preparations and resolve. Jake had spent the autumn months ensuring his cattle had adequate shelter and feed, repairing buildings and equipment, and stockpiling supplies for what might be months of isolation if the mountain passes became impassable. He'd learned from his uncle's example that successful ranching required thinking several seasons ahead and preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. Daniel Murphy had become more than just a hired hand during his 3 years at the Sullivan Ranch. The Irishman possessed an intuitive understanding of cattle and horses that complemented Jake's methodical approach to ranch management, and his easy humor provided a counterbalance to Jake's serious disposition. Daniel had served in the Union Army during the war, though he rarely spoke about his experiences, and Jake sensed in him a fellow traveler who'd learned to live with memories that couldn't be shared with civilians who'd never seen the elephant, as veterans called the experience of combat. The town's chapel, St. Mary's, stood at the eastern end of Main Street, a simple wooden structure that Father Rodriguez had helped the community build during his first year serving the circuit. The building doubled as a meeting hall for community gatherings and served as a school when Sarah needed additional space for her larger classes. Jake had contributed both labor and materials to its construction, not from any surge of religious devotion, but because he understood that communities needed institutions that brought people together for purposes larger than commerce or entertainment. Willow Creek's women had organized themselves into an informal network that provided support during illnesses, births, deaths, and other crises that required collective response. Jake's relationship with this community remained politely distant, though he'd earned their respect through his treatment of Sarah Winters and his willingness to help when emergencies demanded masculine assistance. The women understood that Jake kept his own counsel and respected his privacy while including him in their broader definition of community responsibility. The general store served as more than just a place of business. It functioned as Willow Creek's unofficial communication center where news, gossip, and speculation were exchanged along with goods and services. Tom Mitchell possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's business, financial status, and personal relationships, information he guarded carefully while dispensing advice and mediation when requested. Jake appreciated Mitchell's discretion and had gradually come to trust the storekeeper's judgment about people and situations that might affect his interests. As November deepened and the first serious snowfall blanketed the valley, Jake found himself thinking about the winter ahead, with a mixture of anticipation and unease that he couldn't quite explain. He'd successfully weathered 4 previous winters on his own, but something about this season felt different, charged with possibilities he couldn't identify or predict. His cattle were healthy and well prepared, his buildings were sound, and his supplies were adequate for even an exceptionally harsh winter. Yet he found himself experiencing a restlessness that interfered with his normally steady sleep and focused attention. The isolation that Jake had cultivated as protection against emotional vulnerability was beginning to feel less like strength and more like a limitation that separated him from experiences he couldn't quite name but somehow missed. Watching Sarah Winters work with the children at school, observing the easy camaraderie between married couples in town, listening to Daniel's stories about his family back in Ireland, Jake sometimes wondered if his careful independence had cost him more than he'd gained. These thoughts troubled him because they suggested a dissatisfaction with choices he'd believed were rational and necessary for his survival and success. On the morning of November 18th, Jake woke before dawn with an inexplicable sense that something was different, that the familiar patterns of his life were about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't anticipate or control. The feeling persisted as he completed his morning chores, checked on his cattle, and prepared for what should have been an ordinary day of ranch maintenance and planning. Daniel noticed his distraction but refrained from comment, recognizing the signs of a man wrestling with thoughts he wasn't ready to share. The barn where Jake stored hay and equipment had belonged to his uncle for 20 years before passing to him, and he knew every beam, board, and corner of the structure as intimately as he knew his own house. The building represented security and preparation, containing the resources that would sustain his operation through the winter months ahead. He'd added improvements over the years, strengthening the foundation, improving ventilation, and organizing storage to maximize efficiency and protect valuable supplies from weather and pests. As he approached the barn that morning, Jake noticed that something was subtly wrong with the familiar scene, though he couldn't immediately identify what had changed. His instincts, sharpened by years of frontier living where survival often depended on recognizing danger before it became obvious, warned him that the morning's routine had been altered in some significant way. He paused before entering, listening carefully for sounds that didn't belong, scanning for signs of disturbance that might indicate the presence of animals or unwelcome visitors who could threaten his property or safety. The discovery that awaited him would challenge everything Jake Sullivan thought he knew about strength, independence, and the walls he built around his heart. The barn door creaked on its iron hinges as Jake pushed it open, the familiar sound echoing differently in the morning stillness. Shafts of pale sunlight streamed through gaps in the weathered boards, illuminating motes of dust and hay that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Jake's hand instinctively moved closer to the Colt revolver at his hip, not from any specific threat he could identify, but from the accumulated wisdom of years spent surviving in country where carelessness could prove fatal. The horses in the adjacent stalls nickered softly, their ears pricked forward with an alertness that confirmed his suspicion that something had disturbed the normal order of his domain. Moving with the careful quiet of a man accustomed to hunting and being hunted, Jake advanced into the barn's shadowy interior. His eyes, adjusted to the dim light, swept systematically across the familiar landscape of hay bales, equipment, and stored supplies. Everything appeared to be in its proper place, yet the feeling of wrongness persisted, growing stronger with each step he took toward the back of the building where he kept his winter feed reserves. The barn cats that usually greeted him with demanding meows were nowhere to be seen, another subtle sign that something had altered the normal rhythm of the morning. Near the far corner, where bales of prairie grass created a natural alcove hidden from the main entrance, Jake detected movement that was neither wind nor animal. A soft rustling, barely audible above the settling sounds of the old building, drew his attention to a space he'd visited just yesterday while calculating his feed supplies for the coming months. He approached with measured steps, his breathing controlled and silent, every sense alert for signs of danger or explanation for the disturbance that had set his instincts jangling like alarm bells. What he discovered defied every expectation his frontier-hardened mind could have conjured. Huddled among the hay bales, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak that had seen better days, was a young woman whose condition and circumstances challenged immediate comprehension. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She appeared to be sleeping, though Jake suspected it was the exhausted unconsciousness of someone who had pushed physical endurance beyond safe limits. Her face, partially visible beneath the hood of her cloak, bore the pallor of fatigue and exposure, while her breathing carried the shallow rhythm of someone dancing on the edge of complete collapse. The woman's clothing, what little Jake could observe without disturbing her rest, suggested origins far removed from the frontier pragmatism of Colorado territory. Beneath the travel-stained cloak, he glimpsed fabric and styling that spoke of Eastern cities and refined society, garments designed for comfort and propriety rather than the harsh demands of wilderness survival. Her hands, folded protectively across her midsection, bore none of the calluses or weathering that marked frontier women. Yet they trembled with a vulnerability that stirred something unexpected in Jake's carefully guarded heart. More puzzling still was the obvious evidence of her pregnancy. advanced enough to suggest she was carrying the child into the final months before birth. The practical part of Jake's mind immediately began calculating the impossibility of her situation, a genteel woman, clearly educated and refined, pregnant and apparently alone in country that challenged even experienced frontiersmen with its demands and dangers. How she had arrived at his barn, why she had chosen his property for sanctuary, and what circumstances had driven her to such desperate measures remained mysteries that demanded answers he wasn't certain he wanted to hear. As Jake stood contemplating the unconscious woman and the complications her presence represented, she stirred with the restless movement of someone caught between sleep and waking. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing a startling shade of green that reminded Jake of spring grass after rain. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze as she struggled to reconcile her surroundings with whatever dreams or nightmares had occupied her exhausted mind. When her eyes finally focused on Jake's face, her reaction was immediate and instinctive, a sharp intake of breath, followed by an attempt to push herself further back into the hay bales despite having nowhere to retreat. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying the cultured accents of education and refinement. "I mean no harm. I only needed a place to rest." Her words trembled with fatigue and what Jake recognized as carefully controlled fear, the kind of terror that came from being pursued by dangers that conventional wisdom suggested should remain unspoken. She clutched her cloak more tightly around herself, as if the worn fabric could provide protection against whatever threats had driven her to seek shelter in a stranger's barn. Jake remained motionless, recognizing that any sudden movement might send the woman into panic that could prove dangerous in her condition. Years of dealing with frightened animals had taught him the value of patience and gentle approach when confronting fear, lessons that applied equally well to human encounters fraught with uncertainty and potential danger. He kept his hands visible and away from his weapon, adopting the non-threatening posture that experience had shown was essential when dealing with anyone operating on the edge of desperation. "Easy now," Jake said softly, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used with spooked horses. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you." He studied her face, noting the intelligence that flickered behind the fear, the strength that had somehow carried her through whatever ordeal had brought her to his property. Despite her obvious vulnerability, something in her bearing suggested reserves of courage and determination that frontier life had taught him to recognize and respect. The woman's eyes searched his face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading character and motivation in the expressions of others. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her slightly, though she remained poised for flight, despite her physical condition making rapid movement inadvisable. "You don't understand," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "There are men looking for me. Dangerous men who won't hesitate to hurt anyone who stands in their way. By helping me, you could be putting yourself in terrible danger." Jake's expression didn't change, though her words confirmed suspicions that had been forming since he'd first discovered her presence. In his experience, women didn't seek sanctuary in remote barns unless they were running from troubles that conventional law enforcement either couldn't or wouldn't address. The frontier attracted its share of people fleeing circumstances that polite society preferred not to acknowledge, and Jake had learned to reserve judgment until he understood the full context of their situations. "Reckon I can handle whatever kind of trouble you're running from," Jake replied, settling himself on a hay bale in a position that blocked the barn's main entrance while maintaining enough distance to avoid seeming threatening. "Question is, what kind of help do you need, and how long do you figure you'll need it?" His practical nature immediately began assessing the logistics of providing assistance, while minimizing risk to his own operation and the broader community. The woman studied him with renewed intensity, clearly weighing the decision to trust a stranger against the alternatives available to her in her current circumstances. After a long moment, she reached up and pushed back the hood of her cloak. revealing hair that had once been carefully arranged, but now hung in disheveled waves around her shoulders. More significantly, the gesture revealed a simple wooden cross suspended from a thin chain around her neck, the kind of religious symbol that suggested devotions more serious than casual faith. "My name is Catherine," she said, her voice steadying, as she committed to some internal decision about trusting this taciturn cowboy with information that could prove dangerous for both of them. "Sister Mary Catherine, though I suppose under the circumstances, the title may no longer apply." Her hand moved unconsciously to her swollen abdomen, a gesture that spoke volumes about the complexity of her situation and the conflicts between her religious vows and her current condition. Jake absorbed this information without visible reaction, though his mind immediately began processing the implications of harboring a pregnant nun who was apparently fleeing from unnamed threats. The Catholic Church maintained a presence throughout the territory, though it was often embattled by Protestant denominations and secular authorities who viewed its influence with suspicion. A nun who had violated her vows of chastity would represent a scandal that powerful interests might well kill to suppress, especially if her pregnancy involved men of prominence or political significance. "Sister Catherine," Jake said, testing the name and finding it somehow suited her despite the incongruity of her circumstances. "Can't say I've had much dealing with church folk, but I reckon you wouldn't be sleeping in my barn unless you had compelling reasons for being here instead of somewhere safer and more comfortable." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "Question is whether those reasons are likely to bring trouble to my doorstep and the good people of Willow Creek." Catherine's expression revealed the pain of someone forced to confront the consequences of choices that had seemed right at the time, but had led to circumstances beyond her control or prediction. "The trouble is already coming," she said quietly. "Brother Augustine and his men have been tracking me for 3 weeks. They won't stop until they find me, and they won't care who gets hurt in the process. They believe they're doing God's work, which makes them more dangerous than common criminals because they feel justified in their cruelty." The name meant nothing to Jake, but the fear in Catherine's voice when she spoke, it suggested a threat more serious than embarrassed church officials trying to minimize scandal. In his experience, religious fanatics could prove more ruthless than secular criminals because they believed their cause sanctified any methods they employed. If Catherine was running from church authorities who viewed her pregnancy as evidence of corruption that needed to be eliminated, she was indeed in mortal danger that wouldn't end until she found sanctuary beyond their reach. "How far behind you reckon they are?" Jake asked, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive through various frontier emergencies. If armed men were tracking Catherine to his property, he needed to know how much time he had to prepare defenses or arrange for her safe passage to whatever sanctuary might be available. The approaching winter would complicate any plan that required extensive travel, especially for a woman in Catherine's condition. 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather slows them down, Catherine replied, pulling her cloak more tightly around herself as if the mention of her pursuers had brought a chill that the morning air couldn't explain. "They have good horses and they know this country. Brother Augustine served in the army before he took vows, and the men with him are veterans who know how to track and fight. They won't give up easily." Jake nodded thoughtfully, processing this information against his knowledge of the local terrain and weather patterns. 3 or 4 days provided time for planning and preparation, though not enough for elaborate schemes or lengthy journeys. If Catherine's pursuers were indeed experienced trackers, they would eventually locate his ranch and discover her presence unless he could find a way to throw them off her trail or provide protection sufficient to discourage their continued pursuit. "Reckon we'd better get you inside where it's warm and safe," Jake said, rising from his seat on the hay bale. "You look like you could use food, rest, and medical attention, and we'll need to figure out what to do about Brother Augustine before he arrives with his men." He extended his hand to help Catherine to her feet, noting the way she moved with the careful precision of someone whose pregnancy had advanced far enough to affect her balance and mobility. Catherine accepted his assistance gratefully, though Jake could see the effort it cost her to rise and move toward the barn's entrance. Her condition was more advanced than he'd initially realized, suggesting that the child would arrive within weeks rather than months. This complication would severely limit their options for dealing with her pursuers, as extended travel or hiding in harsh conditions could prove dangerous for both mother and child. As they made their way slowly toward the barn door, Catherine suddenly stopped and grasped Jake's arm with surprising strength. "You don't understand what you're risking," she said urgently. "Brother Augustine believes I've committed sins that threaten the church's authority and purity. He won't hesitate to kill anyone who interferes with what he sees as divine justice. I couldn't live with myself if my presence brought harm to an innocent man who was only trying to help." Jake studied her face, seeing not just fear but genuine concern for his welfare, despite her own desperate circumstances. The combination of vulnerability and strength, of refined education and frontier courage, created contradictions that challenged his assumptions about women, religion, and the nature of moral choices in an imperfect world. Here was someone who had clearly violated religious vows, yet demonstrated authentic care for others, who had fled from spiritual authority, yet retained enough faith to wear a cross around her neck. "Sister," Jake said quietly, "I've been taking care of myself in this country for quite a while now, and I don't scare easy. Whatever trouble you're running from, we'll face it together and figure out a solution that keeps everyone safe, including you and that baby you're carrying." His words carried a conviction that surprised him, suggesting that his carefully maintained emotional distance was already beginning to erode in the face of Catherine's need and courage. As they stepped out of the barn into the morning sunlight, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in ways that would prove more significant than he could possibly imagine. The woman walking beside him represented everything he'd tried to avoid: emotional complexity, moral ambiguity, and the kind of entanglement that could shatter the careful independence he'd built around his heart. Yet something about her courage, her vulnerability, and her obvious need for protection awakened responses he'd thought permanently buried beneath layers of frontier pragmatism. Daniel Murphy's surprised expression when he saw Jake approaching the house with a heavily cloaked woman confirmed that their arrival would create complications throughout the small community of Willow Creek. Word would spread quickly about the mysterious woman staying at the Sullivan ranch, and with it would come speculation, gossip, and questions that could prove dangerous if the wrong people heard the answers. Managing Catherine's presence while protecting her from discovery would require careful planning and the cooperation of people Jake wasn't certain he could trust with such volatile secrets. The morning that had begun with routine chores and familiar patterns had transformed into the opening chapter of a story that would test Jake's beliefs about love, faith, and the price of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. As he helped Catherine up the steps to his modest ranch house, Jake realized that his carefully constructed walls were already beginning to crumble, and for the first time in years, he found himself cautiously optimistic about the possibility that some changes might be worth the risks they brought. Daniel Murphy's weathered face registered surprise, concern, and curiosity in rapid succession as he watched Jake escort the heavily cloaked woman up the porch steps. The Irishman had been splitting firewood near the house when they emerged from the barn, and his experienced eye immediately assessed the woman's condition and the protective way Jake positioned himself beside her. Daniel had worked for Jake long enough to recognize the signs of his employer making decisions that would complicate their normally straightforward existence, though he'd never seen Jake demonstrate such obvious concern for another person's welfare. "Daniel," Jake said simply, his tone conveying both introduction and warning, "this is Sister Catherine. She'll be staying with us for a while." The brevity of his explanation spoke volumes about the sensitivity of the situation and Daniel's Slight nod indicated his understanding that questions would wait until private conversation became possible. The ranch hand's military background had taught him to recognize circumstances requiring discretion, and the tension in Jake's bearing suggested that this particular situation involved dangers that extended beyond the obvious complications of harboring a pregnant woman in their bachelor household. Catherine pulled her hood back far enough to offer Daniel a wan smile, her exhaustion evident despite her efforts to maintain proper courtesy. "I apologize for the imposition," she said, her cultured voice marking her as someone accustomed to more refined circumstances than those available at a frontier ranch. "I wouldn't have imposed on your employer's hospitality if circumstances hadn't left me with few alternatives." Her words carried the weight of genuine regret, while hinting at troubles that proper ladies weren't supposed to discuss with strangers. "No imposition at all, sister," Daniel replied, his Irish accent lending warmth to the formal courtesy that frontier life demanded when ladies were present. "Jake's got a good heart beneath all that serious demeanor, and we've got plenty of room for someone who needs sanctuary." His eyes met Jake's briefly, conveying both support and understanding that whatever protection Catherine required would receive their combined efforts without question or reservation. The interior of Jake's ranch house reflected the practical mindset of a man who valued function over decoration while maintaining the basic standards of cleanliness and order that distinguished civilization from chaos. The main room served multiple purposes, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy wooden table occupying the center space. Simple furniture built for durability rather than elegance filled the room, while Indian blankets and a few family photographs provided modest decoration that suggested comfort without pretension. Catherine's eyes swept the room with the appreciation of someone who understood that frontier hospitality often represented genuine sacrifice rather than casual generosity. The house was clearly designed for men living alone, yet it possessed a warmth and order that spoke well of its owner's character and values. She settled gratefully into the chair Jake indicated near the fireplace, her relief at finding sanctuary temporarily overwhelming the fear that had driven her flight across dangerous territory. "You'll want food and rest," Jake said, his practical nature immediately addressing Catherine's most obvious needs while his mind worked on the larger problems her presence represented. "Daniel, could you heat some of that stew from yesterday and put coffee on? Sister Catherine looks like she hasn't eaten properly in days." His concern manifested itself in action rather than words, the frontier way of demonstrating care without embarrassing displays of emotion. As Daniel busied himself with meal preparation, Jake studied Catherine more carefully in the improved lighting of the house's interior. Her pregnancy was indeed quite advanced, probably 7 or 8 months based on his limited experience with such matters. The strain of her journey showed clearly in her pale complexion and the dark circles beneath her eyes, while her hands trembled slightly with fatigue that extended beyond simple tiredness into the realm of genuine exhaustion that threatened both mother and child. "Sister," Jake began carefully, "we need to talk about what's coming and what options we might have for keeping you safe. Daniel here fought in the war and knows about tactics and defense, so anything you can tell us about Brother Augustine and his men could help us prepare for their arrival." His directness reflected both practical necessity and respect for Catherine's intelligence, treating her as an adult capable of making informed decisions about her own safety. Catherine accepted the cup of hot coffee that Daniel offered with hands that shook slightly, whether from cold, fatigue, or fear remaining unclear. She sipped the bitter brew gratefully before beginning her explanation, her voice gaining strength. As she spoke, Brother Augustine was a cavalry officer before he joined the church. He served under Custer in Kansas and learned to track Apache in Arizona territory. The men with him are all veterans, former soldiers who found purpose in what they believe is religious service. "How many men?" Daniel asked, his military instincts immediately focusing on tactical considerations that would determine their defensive options. The isolation that normally protected the ranch could become a liability if they faced trained fighters who knew their business and weren't constrained by conventional moral limitations. 6, including Augustine, Catherine replied, her memory providing details that suggested she'd observed her pursuers carefully during her flight. They're well armed and experienced with frontier conditions. Augustine believes that my pregnancy represents corruption that threatens the church's authority, and he's convinced the others that eliminating that corruption justifies any measures they might employ. Jake's jaw tightened as he processed this information. 7 armed men with military training represented a formidable threat that his ranch's defenses weren't designed to repel. The approaching winter would limit their mobility and options while providing Augustine's men with time to plan and execute whatever solution they deemed appropriate. Conventional law enforcement was days away and might prove reluctant to interfere in what appeared to be internal church business. What about the father? Daniel asked quietly, his question addressing the obvious complication that Catherine's condition represented. In frontier society, pregnant women typically enjoyed the protection of husbands or male relatives who would defend their interests and safety. Catherine's apparent isolation suggested circumstances that might explain Augustine's confidence in pursuing her across dangerous territory. Catherine's face flushed with shame and defiance as she struggled to answer Daniel's question. "Father Miguel was a good man," she said finally, her voice carrying both love and loss. "He served the mission in Santa Fe where I taught school for the church. When we fell in love, we planned to leave our religious orders and marry, but Augustine discovered our relationship before we could escape." Her hands moved protectively to her swollen abdomen. "Miguel died trying to protect me from Augustine's men. They claimed he resisted arrest, but I know they murdered him." The revelation transformed Catherine's situation from scandal to tragedy, explaining both her flight and Augustine's determination to pursue her. If the church authorities had killed Father Miguel to suppress their relationship, Catherine represented living evidence of both their love and Augustine's crime. Her pregnancy proved the relationship had been consummated, while her survival threatened to expose the brutal methods employed to maintain religious discipline and institutional authority. "So Augustine isn't just trying to suppress scandal," Jake said grimly, understanding now spreading across his features like sunrise, illuminating a familiar landscape. "He's covering up murder, and you're the only witness who can contradict his version of events." The tactical situation suddenly became much clearer and infinitely more dangerous, as Augustine's men would view Catherine's elimination as necessary for their own survival rather than merely convenient for institutional purposes. Catherine nodded, tears threatening despite her efforts to maintain emotional control. "Miguel and I committed no crime except falling in love. We planned to leave the church honorably and build a life together, but Augustine convinced his superiors that our relationship represented heresy that demanded violent correction. They sent him to arrest Miguel, but he was determined not to take Miguel alive." Daniel and Jake exchanged glances that conveyed shared understanding of the deadly serious nature of their situation. Religious fanatics convinced of their own righteousness could prove more dangerous than common criminals because they felt justified in employing any methods necessary to achieve their goals. Augustine's military background would provide tactical skill while his religious convictions would eliminate moral constraints that might otherwise limit his actions. "How much does Augustine know about this area?" Jake asked, his mind already shifting toward defensive planning despite the overwhelming odds they would face. "Has he been through Willow Creek before, or is he tracking you blind?" Local knowledge could provide significant advantages to either side, making Augustine's familiarity with the territory a crucial factor in any defensive strategy. "He's never been here before," Catherine replied, hope flickering in her voice for the first time since her arrival. "They've been following my trail rather than heading for a known destination." If we could somehow obscure that trail or mislead them about my location, it might buy us time to find a more permanent solution to the problem they represent. Jake walked to the window and gazed out at the snow-covered landscape that stretched toward the mountains surrounding Willow Creek. The same winter weather that threatened to trap them with limited escape routes might also provide opportunities to confuse or delay Augustine's pursuit. Fresh snow could hide tracks while harsh conditions might force the pursuers to seek shelter, potentially in Willow Creek itself, where the community might learn about their presence and intentions. "Daniel," Jake said without turning from this window, "ride into town and find Sheriff Hayes. Tell him we've got a situation developing that might require the community's cooperation. Don't mention specifics yet, but make sure he understands that dangerous men might be heading this way with bad intentions." The sheriff's military experience and practical wisdom would prove invaluable in organizing whatever defense might be possible against Augustine's professionals. "What about Sister Catherine?" Daniel asked, already reaching for his coat and hat. "Should I mention her presence to anyone?" The delicate social implications of harboring a pregnant nun required careful handling, especially in a community where religious tensions sometimes ran high between different denominations and secular authorities. "Not yet," Jake replied, his caution reflecting hard-earned wisdom about frontier gossip and its capacity for creating complications. "Let's see how the sheriff thinks we should handle things before we involve more people than necessary." 2. Much talk too early could create problems we don't need. His protectiveness toward Catherine was already extending beyond immediate physical safety into the realm of reputation and social acceptance that would determine her long-term prospects for building a new life. After Daniel departed for town, Jake returned to his chair near the fireplace where Catherine sat staring into the flames with the distant expression of someone reliving painful memories. The crackling fire provided warmth and comfort while casting dancing shadows that seemed to reflect the emotional turmoil hidden beneath her composed exterior. For the first time since discovering her in his barn, Jake found himself truly alone with this mysterious woman whose presence had already begun changing everything about his carefully ordered existence. "Sister," Jake said gently, testing the waters of more personal conversation, "you don't have to carry these burdens alone anymore. Whatever happens with Augustine and his men, you're not facing it by yourself." His words represented a commitment that surprised him with its intensity, suggesting that his emotional walls were crumbling more rapidly than he'd thought possible. Catherine turned to look at him with eyes that held gratitude, surprise, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you risk everything for a stranger whose presence brings nothing but danger and complication to your life?" Her question reflected genuine puzzlement at his willingness to help, suggesting previous experiences with people who'd proven less generous when faced with serious personal risk. Jake considered her question carefully, recognizing that his answer would establish the foundation for whatever relationship might develop between them. The practical response would focus on moral duty and frontier hospitality, but something deeper was driving his protectiveness toward this woman who'd stumbled into his life carrying secrets and sorrows that resonated with his own carefully buried pain. "Maybe because I recognize courage when I see it," Jake said finally, his honesty surprising both of them. "Takes strength to run toward an uncertain future rather than accept a certain death. And it takes even more strength to worry about other people's safety when your own situation looks pretty desperate." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "Besides, seems to me that love shouldn't be a crime, even when it complicates other people's plans." The mention of love brought fresh tears to Catherine's eyes, though she managed to maintain her composure despite the emotional weight of recent losses and current fears. "Miguel believed that love was God's greatest gift to humanity," she said, softly, her voice carrying the reverence of shared faith and intimate memory. "He said that denying love in the name of religious duty was the real heresy, not embracing it when it was offered honestly and purely. Jake found himself moved by her words and the obvious depth of feeling they represented. His own experience with love had ended in disappointment and betrayal, leading him to conclude that emotional attachments were luxuries he couldn't afford. Yet Catherine's story suggested different possibilities, relationships based on genuine affection and shared values rather than the superficial attractions that had proven so unreliable in his past experience. "Sounds like he was a wise man," Jake said, surprised by his own willingness to engage in philosophical discussion about topics he'd avoided for years. "Can't say I've had much luck with love myself, but I respect people who found something worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against them." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Jake immediately moved to the window, his hand instinctively checking his revolver, while his eyes scanned the approaching riders for signs of threat or peaceful intention. Catherine rose from her chair with obvious difficulty, fear returning to her features as she recognized the possibility that Augustine's men had arrived sooner than expected. "It's Daniel with Sheriff Hayes and 2 other men," Jake said, relief evident in his voice as he recognized the familiar figures approaching his house. "Looks like they're taking this situation seriously, which is good news for our prospects of handling whatever Augustine brings our way." His confidence in local law enforcement and community cooperation provided the first real hope that Catherine's ordeal might end with something other than tragedy. As the riders dismounted and approached the house, Jake realized that his quiet life as an independent rancher was ending, replaced by something far more complicated and dangerous. Yet for the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to the challenges ahead rather than simply enduring them. Catherine's presence had awakened something in him that he'd thought permanently lost, a willingness to fight for something beyond mere survival, to risk everything for the possibility of protecting someone who'd captured his respect, and perhaps something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. The approaching confrontation with Augustine would test not only their tactical skills and defensive preparations, but also the strength of bonds that were only beginning to form between a cynical cowboy who'd given up on love and a pregnant nun whose faith had been tested by tragedy but not destroyed by loss. Their story was entering its most dangerous phase, where the price of victory might prove as challenging as the cost of defeat. Sheriff Bob Hayes dismounted with the deliberate movements of a man who'd learned to read dangerous situations before they developed into crises that claimed innocent lives. His weathered face bore the expression of someone processing information while calculating responses, and his eyes swept Jake's property with the professional assessment of a lawman, evaluating defensive positions and potential vulnerabilities. The 2 men accompanying him were Tom Mitchell from the general store and Father Gabriel Rodriguez, whose monthly circuit had brought him to Willow Creek at precisely the moment when his knowledge of church politics and canon law might prove essential to understanding the threat they faced. "Jake," Sheriff Hayes said simply, his greeting carrying the weight of years of mutual respect and shared frontier pragmatism. "Daniel told me you've got a situation developing that could affect the whole community. Said it involved dangerous men with religious motivations and military training, which sounds like the kind of trouble that tends to spread if it's not handled properly from the start." His tone conveyed both concern and confidence in their ability to manage whatever crisis was approaching. Father Rodriguez stepped forward with the gentle authority that marked him as someone accustomed to dealing with human suffering and moral complexity. His dark eyes, intelligent and compassionate, immediately focused on Catherine with the recognition of someone who understood ecclesiastical politics and the brutal methods sometimes employed to maintain institutional control. "Sister Mary Catherine," he said softly, his voice carrying both surprise and understanding. "I heard about the tragedy in Santa Fe. Brother Augustine's version of events reached even our remote parishes. Catherine's reaction to Father Rodriguez's presence was immediate and visceral, a mixture of hope and terror that suggested her experiences with church authority had been uniformly traumatic since Miguel's death. She instinctively moved closer to Jake, seeking protection from someone she'd learned to trust, while her hand moved protectively to her swollen abdomen. "Father," she said carefully, "I pray that you've heard more than Augustine's lies about what happened to Father Miguel and why I'm running for my life. I've heard enough to know that Augustine's interpretation of canon law differs significantly from established church doctrine." Father Rodriguez replied, his diplomatic language concealing what Jake suspected was far more critical assessment of Augustine's methods and motivations. "More importantly, I've heard enough to understand that your safety depends on finding sanctuary beyond Augustine's reach, which may require more than conventional church channels can provide." Tom Mitchell, whose general store served as Willow Creek's unofficial intelligence center, stepped forward with the practical concern of a businessman who understood that violence was bad for commerce and community stability. "Jake, how many men are we looking at, and what kind of weapons are they carrying?" His question reflected the merchant's instinct for assessing problems in terms of resources needed for solutions, an approach that often proved more useful than emotional responses to crisis situations. 7 men, including Augustine, all with military experience and good weapons, Jake replied, his assessment based on Catherine's detailed observations during her flight across dangerous territory. "They're tracking Sister Catherine specifically, but they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who interferes with their mission. Augustine has convinced them that they're doing God's work, which makes them more dangerous than ordinary criminals." Sheriff Hayes absorbed this information with the grim expression of a lawman, calculating odds that didn't favor peaceful resolution. 7 trained fighters represented a force capable of overwhelming Willow Creek's limited law enforcement resources, especially if they were willing to employ the kind of brutal tactics that Augustine had apparently used against Father Miguel. "How much time do we have before they arrive?" he asked, his mind already shifting toward defensive planning and resource allocation. "Catherine thinks maybe 2 or 3 days, depending on weather and how much the fresh snow slows their tracking," Jake answered, unconsciously using her given name rather than her religious title, a subtle indication of the personal connection that was developing between them. "They're good at what they do, but they don't know this country, which might give us some advantages if we can figure out how to use local knowledge effectively." Father Rodriguez moved closer to Catherine, his manner conveying pastoral concern rather than institutional judgment. "Sister, I need to understand the canonical situation clearly if I'm going to help you find permanent sanctuary. Were you and Father Miguel formally released from your vows before your relationship developed? Or we dealing with violations that Augustine might use to justify extreme measures?" Catherine's face reflected the pain of someone forced to confront choices that had seemed clear at the time, but had led to consequences she couldn't have anticipated. "We petitioned for release from our vows through proper channels, but the request was denied without explanation. Miguel believed that our love was blessed by God regardless of institutional approval, and we planned to marry outside the church if necessary." Her voice gained strength as she spoke, suggesting that her faith had survived the trauma of recent events, even as her trust in religious authority had been shattered. "Then Augustine is operating outside canonical law," Father Rodriguez said, firmly, his assessment carrying the weight of theological training and institutional knowledge. "The church may discourage marriages between former religious, but it doesn't authorize violence to prevent them. Augustine has exceeded his authority and committed crimes that no amount of religious justification can excuse." Tom Mitchell's practical mind immediately grasped the implications of Father Rodriguez's statement. "So we're not just protecting Sister Catherine from church discipline. We're protecting a witness to murder and preventing Augustine from completing what amounts to a cover-up operation." His understanding transformed the situation from religious controversy into criminal conspiracy, making community resistance both legally justified and morally imperative. "Exactly," Jake said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd found a cause worth fighting for, despite his general skepticism about religious institutions and their methods. Augustine killed Father Miguel to prevent their marriage. And now he's trying to eliminate Catherine and her child to destroy the evidence of their relationship and his crime. Sheriff Hayes walked to the window and studied the snow-covered landscape with the tactical awareness of someone evaluating defensive terrain. "The weather might actually work in our favor," he observed, his military experience providing insights that civilian minds might miss. "Fresh snow will slow their approach and limit their mobility, while making it harder for them to scout our positions and plan coordinated attacks." "What about the legal situation?" Daniel asked, his practical Irish mind focusing on the complications that might arise from armed resistance to men claiming religious authority. "If we shoot church officials, even corrupt ones, won't that create problems with territorial authorities who might not understand the full situation?" Father Rodriguez answered before Sheriff Hayes could respond, his theological training providing crucial clarification about jurisdictional issues. "Augustine and his men have no legal authority in Colorado territory. They're operating as vigilantes pursuing personal vendettas, not as legitimate church officials executing canonical discipline. Any violence they employ or threaten makes them criminals subject to civil law enforcement." The discussion was interrupted by Sarah Winters arriving on horseback, her medical bag secured behind her saddle and her expression reflecting the urgent concern of someone who'd heard disturbing rumors about developing crisis. "Sheriff Hayes," she called as she dismounted, "I heard there might be wounded people needing medical attention." Daniel said something about dangerous men approaching town with violent intentions. Jake stepped onto the porch to greet Sarah, his protective instincts toward Catherine extending to include anyone who might be endangered by the approaching confrontation. "Sarah, we've got a pregnant woman here who's been traveling hard under dangerous conditions. She could probably use medical examination, and we might all need your skills before this situation resolves itself." Sarah's eyes immediately focused on Catherine with the professional assessment of someone trained to evaluate medical conditions quickly and accurately. "How far along are you, and when did you last have proper medical care?" she asked, her manner conveying competent authority that transcended social conventions about proper introductions and formal courtesies. "About 8 months, and not since. Leaving Santa Fe 3 weeks ago," Catherine replied, gratitude evident in her voice as she recognized Sarah's medical expertise and genuine concern. "The journey has been difficult, and I'm worried about the baby's welfare as well as my own safety." Sarah immediately took charge of Catherine's medical needs with the decisive authority that had made her indispensable to Willow Creek's health and welfare. "We need to get you examined immediately and make sure both you and the baby are stable," she announced, her professional priorities temporarily overriding the tactical discussions that had dominated the conversation. "Sheriff, whatever plans you're making need to account for the fact that we have a woman who could give birth at any time." The medical implications of Catherine's condition added new complexity to an already challenging tactical situation. If labor began during Augustine's approach or attack, they would need to protect both a helpless newborn and a woman temporarily incapacitated by childbirth. The responsibility for multiple vulnerable lives would severely constrain their defensive options while providing Augustine with additional leverage for achieving his murderous objectives. "Tom," Sheriff Hayes said, turning to the storekeeper with the practical recognition that community defense required careful coordination of resources and personnel, "I need you to quietly spread word to the reliable men in town that we might need volunteers for defensive purposes. Don't create panic, but make sure people understand that dangerous strangers might be approaching with hostile intentions." Tom Mitchell nodded his understanding, his merchant's knowledge of community personalities and relationships making him ideal for identifying trustworthy allies while avoiding panic or premature disclosure of sensitive information. Should I mention the religious angle, or keep it focused on general law enforcement concerns? He asked, recognizing the potential for denominational conflicts to complicate community unity. Keep it general for now, Father Rodriguez advised, his experience with religious politics suggesting caution about revealing details that might divide rather than unite community response. Once people understand that we're dealing with criminals rather than legitimate church authorities, the religious aspects become less important than basic law enforcement and community protection. As Sarah conducted her medical examination of Catherine in Jake's bedroom, the men gathered around the kitchen table to plan their defensive strategy. Sheriff Hayes spread Tom Mitchell's hand-drawn map of Willow Creek and the surrounding area across the wooden surface, his finger tracing potential approach routes and defensive positions. They'll probably scout the town first, trying to locate Catherine without revealing their presence, he reasoned, his law enforcement experience providing insights into criminal methodology. What about using that against them? Daniel suggested, his military background offering tactical perspectives that complemented the sheriff's civilian law enforcement experience. If we know they're coming and they don't know we're expecting them, we might be able to set up surveillance and get advance warning of their plans. Jake studied the map with growing appreciation for the strategic possibilities that local knowledge and community cooperation might provide. The old mill overlooks the main approaches to town, he observed, pointing to a position that would provide excellent observation while remaining concealed from casual scrutiny. If we position watchers there, we could track their movements and communicate warnings to defensive positions. Father Rodriguez contributed his own insights based on knowledge of Augustine's personality and methods gained through church communications and personal observation. Augustine is arrogant and believes his religious authority provides immunity from civil law enforcement. The priest explained, his assessment based on direct experience with the man's character and motivations. He'll probably approach the sheriff directly, demanding cooperation in locating Catherine and expecting compliance based on his claimed religious authority. Then we need to be ready for that confrontation, Sheriff Hayes said grimly, his understanding of legal precedents and territorial jurisdiction providing the foundation for their defensive strategy. If Augustine tries to intimidate me with religious authority, I need witnesses present to document his threats and illegal demands. The planning session was interrupted by Sarah's return from examining Catherine, her medical assessment providing both reassurance and additional concerns that would affect their defensive preparations. She's remarkably healthy considering the ordeal she's endured, Sarah reported, her professional opinion carrying the weight of considerable frontier medical experience. However, the combination of physical strain and emotional stress from her escape has brought Catherine dangerously close to going into labor, Sarah explained. I'd estimate she has no more than a week, maybe even less, especially if she's exposed to further stress or exertion. That could trigger early labor. This urgent medical assessment added a new layer of pressure to their defense strategy. Once Catherine went into labor, evacuation would be almost impossible, and her vulnerability would increase significantly, an opportunity Augustine could exploit. Defending someone during active labor would demand both safety and medical infrastructure that would be hard to guarantee if an attack occurred, making it imperative to stop Augustine before he reached them. Is there any chance we could relocate her safely if the situation gets worse? Jake asked, the deep concern in his eyes revealing how much he feared putting Catherine or her child at risk through a tactical misstep. His worry for her well-being clearly outweighed any fear he had for his own safety. Only very short distances, and even then only with extreme care, Sarah replied firmly. Any significant movement could be dangerous, potentially fatal, for both mother and baby. Ideally, she needs to remain still in a protected space until after delivery. But with Augustine closing in, that might not be possible. As the afternoon wore on and shadows stretched across the snow-laden terrain, the defenders of Willow Creek found themselves facing a complex crisis that blended military strategy, emergency medical care, legal boundaries, and ethical dilemmas. Augustine was no longer a looming threat on the horizon. He was an immediate and present danger. The decisions they made now would determine not only Catherine's fate, but the safety and integrity of their entire town. Jake, once a quiet rancher, who had found a frightened pregnant woman hiding in his barn, now found himself leading a resistance that would test whether justice, compassion, and community could stand up against religious extremism and institutional abuse. As he glanced around at his allies gathered at the table, he realized that Catherine had not only opened his heart, but awakened in him a belief that some causes were worth fighting for no matter the cost. Love, he now understood, might be more powerful than the hatred that fueled men like Augustine to kill in the name of God. That night, a fierce winter storm rolled into the valley, bringing both blessing and curse. The heavy snowfall muffled sound and cut visibility to a few yards, while the shrieking wind echoed the tension each person felt, knowing what the next dawn might bring. From his bedroom window, Jake watched the restless figure of Catherine sleeping in the bed they'd prepared for her breathing uneven under the dual weight of nearing childbirth, and the knowledge that Augustine was drawing closer with every hour. Sarah had moved into the house to stay near Catherine, offering constant medical oversight and much-needed companionship. The two women had formed a bond rooted in mutual respect and shared strength, both of them understanding how difficult it was for women to survive, let alone fight, on the frontier. Sarah's quiet skill grounded the household, while Catherine's quiet courage and unwavering faith inspired everyone around her. Out in the barn, Daniel kept watch, his vantage point providing both shelter and a clear view of the surrounding terrain. With years of combat experience, he was attuned to the subtle signs of danger, and tonight, the nervous movements of the horses told him that something beyond the storm was stirring. Elsewhere in the valley, Sheriff Hayes had posted sentries at key positions, forming a web of lookouts designed to detect any enemy approach in time to respond. And soon, muffled beneath the snow and wind, came the sound of horses, multiple riders moving with the discipline of trained fighters, used to operating in hostile conditions. Daniel's sharp whistle cut through the storm, confirming what Jake had already sensed. Augustine had arrived, using the storm as cover for his approach. Augustine rode at the front of his group, a tall, commanding figure cloaked in a heavy coat that concealed his priestly attire while highlighting his military posture. The men behind him were hardened warriors, bound to him by promises of divine justice and revenge, soldiers without a war, now marching under a religious banner twisted by Augustine's personal crusade. The confrontation didn't begin with violence, but with Augustine's assumption that his authority would be obeyed without resistance. He rode straight to Sheriff Hayes's office and knocked, expecting immediate compliance. "Sheriff Hayes," he announced when the door opened, his voice blending educated confidence with the force of command. "I am Brother Augustine, here to investigate grave violations of church law. I require your assistance locating a fugitive nun who has broken her vows and defied religious authority." Sheriff Hayes studied him carefully, the practiced gaze of a lawman who had seen many dangerous men disguised in many forms. "Brother Augustine," he replied evenly, "you're outside your jurisdiction. This is Colorado territory. We follow civil law here, and church authority has no bearing on criminal proceedings in this county." Augustine bristled, his pride clearly wounded. "You don't grasp the seriousness of this matter. Sister Mary Catherine has committed sins that endanger the spiritual integrity of this community. Her actions must be stopped before they corrupt others." A new voice rang out before Hayes could reply. "The only corruption here," said Father Rodriguez, stepping from the shadows where he'd waited for just this moment. Is your abuse of spiritual power to pursue personal vengeance? Augustine's surprise at seeing the younger priest was evident. Had not expected to face an actual representative of the church who might challenge his self-declared authority. The theological confrontation that followed laid bare just how far Augustine had strayed from church doctrine. Father Rodriguez calmly outlined canonical law and how Augustine had broken it, peeling back the pious facade to reveal a man driven more by ambition and violence than faith. "You dare challenge my authority?" Augustine barked, his mask slipping to reveal the brute force underneath. "I've spent years purging rot from the church, cleansing it of threats that cowards like you refuse to acknowledge. Sister Catherine and her bastard child represent contamination that must be cleansed before it spreads." The words sealed Augustine's fate by revealing his true intentions before witnesses, who could testify to his threats and illegal demands. Sheriff Hayes stepped forward with the quiet authority of a lawman prepared to enforce territorial law against anyone who threatened the peace and safety of his community. "Brother Augustine, you're under arrest for making terroristic threats and conspiracy to commit murder. Your men can surrender peacefully or face the consequences of resisting legal arrest." Augustine's response was swift and violent, drawing a concealed revolver with the speed of someone whose military training had prepared him for precisely such confrontations. His shot shattered the lamp in Sheriff Hayes's office, while his shout brought his waiting men charging through the storm toward what they expected would be a brief and decisive assault on unprepared civilians. The battle that erupted across Willow Creek that night became the stuff of legend, a clash between religious fanaticism and frontier justice that tested every soul who participated in its savage resolution. Augustine's men were skilled and experienced, but they faced defenders who knew the terrain intimately and fought with the desperate courage of people protecting their homes and neighbors against an enemy that threatened everything they valued. Jake's ranch became the focal point of the conflict, as Augustine correctly guessed that Catherine would be sheltered there, rather than in the more obvious sanctuary of the town's chapel. The approach to the house became a killing ground where military experience met frontier cunning in a contest that left several of Augustine's men wounded or dead in the snow-covered yard. Inside the house, Catherine's labor began with the violence and chaos raging outside, her cries of pain mixing with the crack of gunfire and the shouts of men fighting for their lives in the storm-swept darkness. Sarah worked frantically to assist the birth, while Jake and Daniel fought to hold defensive positions that would protect both mother and child from enemies, determined to eliminate all evidence of the love that had brought this crisis upon them. The turning point came when Augustine himself attempted to storm the house, his religious hatred overcoming tactical caution as he abandoned his remaining men to pursue his obsession with destroying Catherine and her unborn child. He found Jake waiting in the main room, the cowboy's revolver steady despite the exhaustion of hours spent fighting off determined attackers. "She's given birth to a son," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying both triumph and warning as Augustine stepped through the doorway. "A healthy boy who's going to grow up knowing that his parents loved each other enough to die for that love. You're too late to prevent what you came here to stop." Augustine's face contorted with rage and defeat as he realized that his months of pursuit had failed to achieve its primary objective. "Then I'll finish what I should have completed in Santa Fe," he snarled, raising his weapon toward the bedroom where Catherine lay with her newborn son. The shot that ended Augustine's life came not from Jake's gun, but from Daniel's rifle, fired from the doorway with the precision of a marksman who'd learned his trade during the war between the states. Augustine fell without firing, his weapon clattering across the wooden floor as his life bled away onto the boards of a house where love had triumphed over hatred, despite terrible cost. The aftermath brought peace to Willow Creek and a new beginning for the survivors of Augustine's crusade. Catherine recovered quickly from childbirth, her strength returning as she held her son and contemplated a future free from the fear that had driven her flight across dangerous territory. The boy, whom she named Michael in honor of his father, would grow up in a community that had proven its willingness to fight for justice and protect the innocent against those who would abuse religious authority for criminal purposes. Jake's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable result of the entire ordeal. The man who'd sworn off love discovered that protecting Catherine and her child had awakened feelings he'd thought permanently buried beneath layers of frontier pragmatism and emotional caution. When he asked her to marry him on a spring morning 6 months after Augustine's death, her acceptance marked the beginning of a partnership that would become legendary throughout Colorado territory. Father Rodriguez performed the ceremony in Willow Creek's chapel, his blessing carrying the weight of church approval for a union that had been born from tragedy, but nurtured by courage and sacrifice. The community that had rallied to protect Catherine welcomed her as a permanent resident whose presence had tested and strengthened their bonds of mutual support and shared values. Sarah Winters became young Michael's unofficial aunt and medical guardian, her friendship with Catherine deepening into the kind of sisterhood that frontier women cherished as essential for survival and happiness in an often harsh and unforgiving land. Tom Mitchell's store served as headquarters for the informal network of protection and support that ensured no enemy of the Sullivan family would ever again threaten the peace of Willow Creek. Sheriff Hayes received commendations from territorial authorities for his handling of what could have become a religious war capable of destabilizing the entire region. His steady leadership during the crisis enhanced his reputation throughout Colorado territory and established Willow Creek as a community where law enforcement served justice rather than political expedience or religious prejudice. The story of the cowboy who didn't believe in love until he found a pregnant nun hiding in his barn became part of frontier folklore, told and retold around campfires and in saloons throughout the West. Each telling emphasized different aspects of the tale, but all versions agreed on its central message that love could overcome hatred, courage could defeat fanaticism, and ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they stood together against those who would abuse power to harm the innocent. Years later, when Michael Sullivan had grown into a young man preparing to attend college in Denver, visitors to Willow Creek would often ask to see the barn where his mother had first found sanctuary and the house where he'd been born during a battle between good and evil. Jake and Catherine would smile at such requests, remembering the fear and uncertainty of those dark November days when their love had seemed impossible and their survival unlikely. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory, while maintaining its reputation as a place where travelers in need could find assistance and protection. Daniel Murphy remained their foreman and closest friend, his loyalty to the family becoming legendary among ranch hands throughout Colorado territory. The barn where Catherine had hidden was preserved exactly as it had been that morning when Jake discovered her among the hay bales, a monument to the power of unexpected grace to transform even the most carefully guarded hearts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.